Whitmore University, nestled in the tranquil landscapes of Oregon, was known for its academic excellence and commitment to fostering free thought. It was an institution where ideas clashed, debates flourished, and the next generation of thinkers emerged. Among its distinguished faculty was Professor Barron Trump, a man who had long distanced himself from the political spotlight that once defined his family. With an unwavering dedication to intellectual discourse, Barron had built a reputation as a formidable scholar of public perception and media influence. On a crisp autumn afternoon, in Lecture Hall 305, Barron prepared to deliver a lecture on the power of narratives in shaping public opinion. His students, a diverse mix of aspiring journalists and political analysts, filled the seats, eager to absorb his insights. But among them sat one figure whose presence was anything but ordinary: Taylor Lorenz, the controversial journalist known for her relentless critiques of public figures and her sharp, often polarizing take on media influence. Taylor had come under the pretense of observing the lecture, but her real intention was far from academic curiosity. Having built a career on dissecting the reputations of those in power, she saw Barron Trump as an enigma. Once a quiet figure in the Trump dynasty, now a respected intellectual voice, and she was determined to challenge him. As Barron delved into his lecture dissecting the mechanics of public perception, Taylor, seated near the front, listened intently. The room was engaged, drawn into his analysis of how media entities shape reality, often blurring the line between truth and manipulation. But then, in a moment designed to turn the tide of the discussion, Taylor raised her hand. "Professor Trump," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent years dominating conversations in the media. "If we're discussing narratives, wouldn't it be fair to examine the one surrounding your own mother? A woman whose public image has been curated to project elegance and virtue while remaining largely silent on the issues that matter? Wouldn't you agree that she is the epitome of manufactured perception?" The room tensed. A hush fell over the students as all eyes turned to Barron. The challenge was unmistakable. Taylor had not come to engage in a discussion, she had come to provoke. Barron, standing at the podium, regarded her calmly. He had spent years honing his ability to separate emotion from discourse, but this was different. This was personal. And yet, instead of taking the bait, he leaned forward slightly, his expression measured. "Miss Lorenz," he said, his voice steady, "you raise an interesting point. The media does have a tendency to craft personas, often ignoring the complexities of the individuals behind them. But let's examine your own role in this ecosystem. As a journalist, your profession dictates that you seek the truth. Yet, time and again, your work has been criticized for perpetuating the very manufactured perceptions you claim to condemn. Are you willing to be held to the same standard you hold others to?" A murmur ran through the lecture hall. Students exchanged glances, recognizing the turn the conversation had taken. Taylor, unshaken, smirked. "That's an interesting deflection, Professor Trump, but let's not stray. Your mother chose a life in the public eye. Critique comes with the territory. Or are you suggesting she should be exempt from scrutiny?" Barron exhaled slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm suggesting that scrutiny should be rooted in fairness. If we are to analyze public figures, we must do so with intellectual honesty. The problem isn't criticism. It's the ease with which we reduce complex individuals to caricatures for the sake of engagement metrics and headlines. You, of all people, should understand that." Taylor's smirk faltered for just a moment, the weight of the words settling in the air. The students, now leaning forward in their seats, were witnessing something extraordinary, an intellectual duel between two formidable minds, one rooted in academia, the other in media warfare. For a moment, it seemed as though Taylor might press further, escalate the tension. But instead, she leaned back in her chair, offering a slow, thoughtful nod. "Oosh, Professor," she admitted, the sharpness in her tone softening ever so slightly. Barron didn't gloat, didn't press his advantage. Instead, he turned back to the class. "This," he said, gesturing between himself and Taylor, "is the kind of dialogue that moves society forward. Not echo chambers, not manufactured outrage, but real, critical engagement. If you take anything from today's lecture, let it be this. Always question the narratives you're given, even the ones that come from those who claim to be the gatekeepers of truth." The room erupted into applause, not because Barron had won the exchange, but because he had transformed what could have been a clash into a moment of profound intellectual engagement. Taylor remained silent for the rest of the lecture, but as the students filtered out, she lingered near the exit. Before leaving, she turned back to Barron, her expression unreadable. "You are not what I expected," she said finally. Barron gave a small, knowing smile. "That's the problem with narratives," he replied. "They rarely capture the whole story." As Taylor exited, Barron watched her go, knowing that in a world obsessed with controlling the narrative, the most powerful move one could make was refusing to be defined by it. The tension in Lecture Hall 3-5 was palpable. Professor Barron Trump, standing firmly at the podium, let his gaze sweep across the room. Taylor Lorenz, the journalist who had attempted to challenge him, had been met with an unexpected but measured response. The intellectual duel between them had left the students hanging on every word, their expectations turned on their heads. But the confrontation was far from over. Taylor, still seated near the front, crossed her arms. "All right, Professor Trump," she said, her voice laced with a new edge. "If we're talking about narratives, let's discuss one more. Your name alone carries a weight most people can never escape. Do you really believe you've built your reputation without the legacy of your family following you?" The question was a dagger aimed straight at Barron's credibility. A murmur spread through the class. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned in, eager to witness his response. Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step forward. "That's a fair question," he admitted, his voice carrying both strength and clarity. "Legacy is inescapable. We are all shaped by our past, whether we like it or not, but the true measure of a person isn't the name they inherit. It's what they do with it." Taylor arched a brow, but before she could interject, Barron continued. "I could have chosen to hide to let my name dictate my path, or to ride its advantages without effort. Instead, I chose to challenge myself in a space where my name shouldn't matter. I built my expertise, studied relentlessly, and earned my place here. You, on the other hand, have made a career of challenging others, sometimes fairly, but often in ways that simplify complex individuals into narratives that fit your desired storyline. Are you willing to have your own work scrutinized as intensely as you scrutinize others?" The air in the room grew heavier. Taylor opened her mouth, but for a moment, no words came. She was not used to being the one under examination. The students, sensing the shift in power, watched intently. Barron let the silence settle before he delivered his final point. "It's easy to deconstruct the image of others when they're not in the room to speak for themselves. But the mark of real integrity isn't in tearing people down for sport. It's in having the courage to listen when confronted with a perspective that challenges your own." A few students exchanged glances, nodding. Some even began clapping lightly. Taylor, though clearly unsettled, offered a slow, small smile. "Well played, Professor Trump," she murmured, rising from her seat. "I suppose even a journalist needs to be reminded of that once in a while." She turned to leave, the weight of the exchange lingering in the air. Barron watched her go, then faced his class. "Remember this moment," he told them. "The way we engage in discourse defines the kind of society we create. Never let the easy route of mockery replace the harder path of true understanding." The room erupted in applause. It was not just a lesson in media influence. It had become a lesson in character, in the power of standing firm, and in the undeniable strength of a well-reasoned voice. And as Barron stepped away from the podium, he knew this was a moment they would all carry with them long after the lecture had ended. The discussion that had ignited in Lecture Hall 305 did not fade away with the applause. Instead, it continued to ripple through Whitmore University, reaching beyond academic circles and into social discourse. The video of Barron Trump's calm yet powerful rebuttal had spread online, drawing both admiration and critique from viewers across the spectrum of public opinion. But in the midst of this newfound attention, another unexpected event was about to unfold. Days after the confrontation, Professor Barron Trump walked into his next lecture, expecting to continue his curriculum on media narratives. However, waiting for him at the entrance of the hall was none other than Taylor Lorenz. Unlike their previous interaction, this time, she did not come as a student observer, but rather as a journalist, intent on revisiting their debate in a more public setting. "Professor Trump," she said, microphone in hand, a camera crew behind her, "your recent remarks have sparked an incredible response. Would you be willing to answer a few questions on the record?" The students gathering inside the hall paused, sensing the weight of the moment. Some pulled out their phones, eager to record yet another intellectual exchange between the two. Barron, remaining composed, gestured toward the lecture hall. "You are welcome to listen, Ms. Lorenz," he said, "but if we are to have a discussion, let's do it in a way that upholds the integrity of the conversation." Taylor hesitated. She had anticipated either rejection or defensiveness, but Barron had offered neither. Instead, he welcomed her in, as if to remind her that true discourse requires more than just sound bites. As the lecture began, Barron took a different approach than usual. Today, he announced, we will discuss not just how narratives are shaped, but also how they are corrected. The students murmured in anticipation, knowing this was a direct nod to the events of the past week. It's easy to assume that public figures are simple, one-dimensional representations of their public personas. But what happens when those figures challenge the narrative crafted about them? More importantly, how do we as consumers of information choose to engage with the truth? Taylor, still holding her microphone but now seated among the students, listened intently. Barron continued, "This is where journalists, influencers, and media personalities hold enormous power, but also enormous responsibility. Ms. Lorenz, perhaps you can offer insight on this. How does one reconcile the necessity of public critique with the ethical obligation to represent individuals fairly?" The room turned to Taylor. She hadn't expected to be called upon in this way, but the challenge was clear. After a brief pause, she cleared her throat. "I think," she began, "that the speed at which information spreads often makes nuance difficult. We sometimes distill people down to digestible narratives because that's what audiences engage with most." Barron nodded. "And therein lies the problem. In simplifying, do we strip individuals of their complexity, and if so, at what cost?" A heavy silence settled. The students absorbed the weight of his words, understanding that this wasn't just about Melania Trump, or even about Barron himself. It was about a larger societal issue, the ease with which public figures are reduced to stereotypes, the way criticism turns into spectacle, and how quickly discourse descends into outrage rather than understanding. Taylor set her microphone down. "You make a fair point," she admitted. "Maybe it's time we, as media professionals, take a step back and reassess how we shape public perception." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. It wasn't an admission of guilt, nor was it a full agreement, but it was a moment of reflection, something rarely seen in high-stakes media debates. As the lecture concluded, students left with a renewed understanding of the power of media, the weight of words, and the importance of questioning narratives rather than simply accepting them. And as Taylor walked out of Lecture Hall 305, she carried with her a story she hadn't expected to find, one not just about Barron Trump, but about the power of respectful dialogue in an era of media sensationalism. Barron has always remained composed, but for the first time since the controversy began, he allowed himself a small smile. The conversation had changed, and in the end, that was always the goal. The impact of Barron Trump's words continued to reverberate long after the lecture at Whitmore University. His message of empathy and constructive dialogue had struck a chord not only within the classroom, but across the digital landscape as well. Yet, as with all viral moments, it was only a matter of time before the attention led to unforeseen consequences. As the video continued to spread, media outlets picked up the story, dissecting every word, every pause, every glance exchanged between Barron and Professor Grayson. Some praised his poise and insight, calling it a masterclass in measured discourse. Others, however, sought to twist the narrative, framing it as a calculated moment rather than a genuine expression. Speculation swirled. Was this an orchestrated attempt to reshape his public image? Was Barron simply another figure using the power of media to his advantage? The speculation reached its peak when an invitation arrived at Barron's desk, a request for a televised debate. The invitation came from none other than journalist Taylor Lorenz, whose previous interaction with Barron had already captivated audiences. This time, however, she wanted a formal discussion, one that would be broadcasted to millions. For days, Barron wrestled with the decision. He had never sought the spotlight, never aimed to be a public figure in the way the rest of his family had, yet he understood that rejecting the invitation could be seen as retreating, as though he lacked the confidence to stand by his words. On the other hand, accepting meant stepping into an arena that was far less forgiving than an academic lecture hall. As he sat in his office contemplating his next move, a soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Professor Grayson, She entered, her usual air of authority softened by something Barron hadn't quite seen before: concern. "I heard about the debate offer," she said, sitting across from him. "Are you going to accept?" Barron hesitated before replying. I'm not sure yet. It feels like stepping into something much larger than I intended." Grayson nodded thoughtfully. "That's because it is, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing." Barron exhaled, rubbing his temples. "I don't want to turn this into a spectacle. The moment in the lecture hall was real. I don't want that to be lost in all of this." Grayson leaned forward. "Then make sure it doesn't get lost. The power of what you said wasn't in the debate, it was in the way you approached it. You didn't attack, you didn't mock, you simply challenged a perspective. If you do decide to go through with this, don't let them pull you into their game. Stick to yours." Her words resonated with Barron. Perhaps this wasn't just about him. Perhaps this was an opportunity to further emphasize what he had been trying to say all along. 2 days later, Barron's response was made public. He had accepted the debate, but with one condition: it would not be a battle of sound bites. He would engage in a conversation, not a confrontation. There would be no gotcha questions, no ambush tactics, just an honest, respectful exchange of ideas. The world waited with bated breath to see how the next chapter of this unexpected journey would unfold. In today's fast-paced and often polarized American society, Barron Trump's approach to dialogue offers a crucial lesson: the power of measured discourse. Instead of engaging in reactionary arguments or personal attacks, he demonstrated the importance of respectful debate and thoughtful communication. In a world where social media thrives on outrage and headlines prioritize controversy over context, we must ask ourselves, are we truly listening to one another, or are we just waiting for our turn to respond? The ability to challenge perspectives without resorting to hostility is a skill that can transform not only personal relationships, but also national discourse. Imagine if political debates, social justice discussions, or even family disagreements were approached with the same level of calm and reasoning. Would we see more progress? Would our divisions begin to heal? We often hear about the importance of free speech, but do we equally value the responsibility that comes with it? Are we using our voices to create meaningful conversations or to simply win arguments? Now we turn to you. What are your thoughts? How do you think we can foster a culture of dialogue rather than division? Drop your opinions in the comments and let's start a conversation that matters.